To Somalia now, and American officials have confirmed U.S. Special Forces helped carry out Wednesday's raid against al-Shabaab militants. They were accompanied by Somali troops. The militant group claims it fought off foreign fighters in the central part of the country, but U.S. officials say several militants were killed. Wednesday's raid comes days after American airstrikes against al-Shabaab positions. At least 150 militants were reportedly killed. It appears as if the United States is stepping up its efforts against al-Shabaab, but the group is still able to launch devastating attacks across Somalia. Now, the United States has a history of military involvement in Somalia. CCTV's Clementine Logan takes us through some of the most significant moments.
In 1991, Somali President Mohamed Siad Barre was ousted. A power struggle then erupted between clan warlords. Thousands of civilians died in the conflict. In 1992, US Marines landed near Mogadishu, ahead of a UN peacekeeping force meant to restore peace in the country. But in 1993, disaster struck. US Army Rangers were killed when Somali militias shot down 2 US helicopters. A battle ensued between American Special Forces and Somali militia fighters. Hundreds of Somalis died. Reports emerged of atrocities too. The bodies of American soldiers were dragged through the streets. And by March 1994, the United States had ended its mission in Somalia. In 2007, America returned to the country, this time with airstrikes. Then, in September 2012, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed was elected president. A year later, Washington recognized Somalia's government for the first time since 1991. That marked a new era of military involvement. In 2014, US drones killed al-Shabaab's leader. Soon after, US Secretary of State visited Somalia, the first one to do so. Since then, the States has stepped up its involvement against militants in the country. The Pentagon considers Somalia a crucial front in the global war against terror. Clementine Logan, CCTV.
Let's get more details now on this development from Somalia. And CCTV's Daniel Rengis is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Daniel, the U.S. has confirmed the involvement of its special forces in the operation on Tuesday, barely a day after it's conducted a high-casualty strike that involved multiple U.S. airstrikes, aircraft, including drones and jet fighters. What's the explanation for this U.S. escalation in Somalia?
Well, there are specific tactical kinetic reasons on the ground why they've taken strikes, but also much broader strategic reasons as well. In the case of the airstrikes that occurred a few days ago, I think that they were conducting aerial surveillance. They'd received intelligence from the Somalis about this site, and they believed that they were training for an imminent attack on US and African Union forces, and therefore they described it as being in a defensive nature. But more broadly, when they see targets like this, it seems a little bit more like they're willing to take on not just the Somali al-Shabaab leadership, but also some of the mid or lower range forces as well. And I think that speaks to the fact that they now see a growing international threat from these movements in places like Somalia. And therefore they feel justified to take more action going forward. So I think the fact that we're seeing this seemingly expansion of attacks in Somalia, speaks not only to the conditions on the ground, to a much broader concern about the spread of Islamic extremism around Africa.
Well, Daniel, that seeming expansion, though, is a little bit surprising for the region here, but there has apparently been very little appetite for large-scale direct U.S. military involvement in Somalia, especially since the Black Hawk Down incident in the early 1990s. Do we expect this to change anytime soon?
Well, it does appear to be shifting. The Obama administration hasn't signaled a major change in policy, but there is definitely a shift going around for anybody who's observing what's going on, because in most of the Obama administration presidency, you saw him being very cautious about the kinds of strikes that they would make in Africa and elsewhere. particularly relying heavily on the use of drone airstrikes, but only, as I said, targeting very major figures within each of the movements. So very, very broad tactical decisions being made. But what we see now is much more kinetic action on the ground. So many more US forces advising local forces. And I think in this case it's an interesting example because there's a tension between the reporting on whether this was mostly Somalis or whether it was partially American going in to do the fighting. The Pentagon is saying that yes, they used American attack helicopters. They're not saying definitely that they weren't on the ground, but they're saying that the Somalis were right at the front of the battle. And it gives you an impression of the sensitivity here. But what's very clear is that the US, from the president on down, is prepared to take much greater risks, given the fact that they've now assessed that this threat is spreading and growing in many parts of Africa, not just with ISIL, but also with al-Qaeda, particularly the fact that Somalia is connected with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The Yemen situation is very complex, so I think they are trying to dampen that down.
All right, Daniel Ranges for us there in Washington, D.C. Thank you.